The city glittered beneath the penthouse windows, a sea of gold and silver stretching endlessly beyond the skyline.
Andrew Cadine stood at the edge of the Grand Lounge, his fingers wrapped loosely around a crystal glass of aged bourbon. The air hummed with low jazz, the murmur of high-stakes conversations, and the clinking of glasses. Another night among New York's elite, where power was a currency as valuable as money itself.
Tell Andrew. Lawrence Berkeley's smooth voice cut through the chatter.
He leaned back in his chair, amusement dancing in his eyes as he swirled his whiskey. What's left for a man who has everything? Andrew smirked. He had built an empire from the ground up, Cadine Capital, one of the most formidable investment firms in the country. He owned skyscrapers, dictated stock markets, and controlled boardrooms with a single call. He had everything, except boredom. And that, he had in abundance. Lawrence, his longtime rival and occasional ally, grinned.
I bet he could give you a challenge. Andrew arched a brow. You're terrible at bets, Lawrence. Remember the time you took your cult out bit ME on the Madison Avenue project?
How'd that turn out? Lawrence chuckled, tipping his glass.
Touché.
But this is different.
So meeting outside your spritzheads and business Takeo affairs. So meeting real.
Andrew took a slow sip, intrigued. Go on. Lawrence leaned forward, his voice lowering. I bet you wouldn't last a year married to someone completely out of your league, someone from the real world. Andrew laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Marriage?
That's your grand challenge.
Lawrence's grin widened. Not just any marriage. I choose the woman. And if you make it to 1 year, publicly, legally, and as a real husband, you win a 10% stake in Burke Oil. Silence fell between them. Burke Oil was a behemoth, one of the most sought-after assets in the industry. It had eluded Andrew for years, locked behind old money and family dynasties. A calculated risk. A ridiculous challenge. But what was life without a little amusement?
Andrew swirled his drink, wetting the amber liquid catch the light. And was a lucky woman.
Lawrence's smirk turned wicked.
Regina Voka.
Pregnant. Widowed.
7 kids. Barely scraping by.
Andrew's glass paused midair. He knew Lawrence was insane, but this? 7 kids, he repeated, incredulous. 7. Lawrence tossed his phone onto the table. A photograph filled the screen, Regina Walker, standing in the middle of a cramped apartment, a toddler clinging to her leg while she held a sleeping infant in her arms. Dark circles lined her eyes, exhaustion carved into every inch of her expression. Andrew studied the image, an unfamiliar discomfort prickling at the back of his mind. The woman in the photo looked nothing like the polished socialites or ambitious businesswomen he typically associated with. She was real. Tired, struggling, human. And completely, utterly wrong for his world.
Scarlet, Cadine. Lawrence taunted.
Andrew downed the rest of his bourbon in one swift motion and set the glass down with a sharp clink. Draw up the contract, he said. I'll have a ring on her finger by the end of the week. Regina Walker sat at the small wooden table in her cramped kitchen, staring at the stack of unpaid bills. The dim glow from the lone overhead light cast long shadows across the room, exaggerating the deep lines of exhaustion on her face. The laughter of her children filtered in from the next room, a melody that both comforted and reminded her of the insurmountable weight she carried alone. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for another grueling day ahead. The morning would bring the usual routine, getting the kids ready, rushing to work, balancing 2 jobs while praying she wouldn't be late for her shift at the diner. The cycle never ended. But before she could sink further into her thoughts, a sharp knock at the door cut through the stillness. Frowning, Regina wiped her hands on her worn apron and moved to open it. The sight that greeted her was the last thing she expected. A man stood before her, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his presence so out of place against the peeling paint of her front door that she wondered if he had knocked by mistake. His stance was composed, his posture straight, and his dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. He exuded confidence, the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about overdue rent or how to put food on the table. Ms. Walker? He asked, his voice smooth and deliberate.
She hesitated before nodding. Yes. Mein Name is Andrew Cadine.
He paused as if waiting for recognition, but none came. I'd like to speak with you about a proposal. Regina's grip on the door tightened. She had dealt with her fair share of scams, loan sharks, and empty promises. She had learned the hard way that nothing in life came without a cost. If you're selling something, I'm not interested, she said flatly. Andrew's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, but his eyes remained unreadable.
Jeg suger jo ms. Voker, I'm not here to sell anything.
Regina hesitated, her instincts warring against her curiosity. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside.
Fine.
You have 5 minutes. Andrew entered, his gaze sweeping over the modest interior. It was a small space but filled with warmth. The scent of fresh bread lingered in the air, and drawings from her children covered the refrigerator. A stark contrast to the pristine cold world he came from. Regina motioned for him to sit, but Andrew remained standing. I'll get straight to the point, he said.
Inita wife. Regina blinked.
Excuse me. A temporary wife, he clarified. For 1 year.
She let out a short, humorless laugh.
Is this some kind of joke?
No.
It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. His voice remained calm, unaffected by her skepticism. I will provide financial security for you and your children. A home. A life free from the struggles you currently face. In return, you will agree to a legal marriage with me for 1 year. At the end of that time, we will go our separate ways, and you will be well compensated. Regina stared at him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but Andrew Cadine's face was unreadable. You want to marry me, she repeated slowly, trying to process his words.
A woman you just met. Yes.
She folded her arms.
Why?
Andrew exhaled, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. I need a wife for business reasons. It is necessary for my long-term goals.
Regina narrowed her eyes.
And you just happened to choose me? I don't believe in coincidences, Ms. Walker. You were recommended as someone trustworthy and resilient.
By who?
That's not important.
Regina's mind reeled.
This was absurd. Insane. And yet, a life free from struggle. A future for her children. She thought about the endless nights working 2 shifts back-to-back, the worry in her eldest son's eyes when he saw how exhausted she was, the gnawing fear of eviction that never left her. What's the catch? She asked finally. Andrew tilted his head slightly. You would be my wife in name only. Public appearances, family events.
No romantic obligations.
Her stomach twisted. A business deal, then. Cold.
Transaktional.
She had sworn she would never sell herself, never compromise her dignity for money. But this wasn't the same, was it? Andrew reached into his pocket and placed a check on the table.
Regina's breath hitched.
The amount written on it was more than she had ever seen in her entire life. Enough to pay off every debt, secure a future for her children, and give them a chance at a life she never had. Her pride screamed at her to say no. But the mother in her whispered. This could be the way out. She looked up at Andrew Cadine, the man who had just walked into her life and turned it upside down. And with a steady voice, she said, I'll do it. But neither of them knew that this arrangement, this business proposition, would soon become far more complicated than either of them had ever anticipated. Regina Walker sat in stunned silence, her hands resting on the table as she stared at the check before her. The number printed on it was almost unreal, an amount of money she had never seen in her life, let alone had in her possession. It was enough to change everything, enough to ensure her children never went hungry again, never had to move from one place to another, never had to live in fear of eviction. And yet, the weight of what she was agreeing to settled heavily on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Across from her, Andrew Cadine watched her carefully, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed yet calculated, as if he had anticipated every reaction she might have. There was something unnerving about his composure, the way he spoke with such certainty, as if he knew without a shadow of a doubt that she would accept his offer. You'll have a contract to review before anything becomes official, Andrew said, his voice smooth and unwavering. I want you to be fully aware of what this arrangement entails. You'll have time to read through it before signing, and if there's anything you're unclear about, my legal team will be available to answer your questions. Regina swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. And what exactly does this contract say? Andrew leaned back slightly, lacing his fingers together as he rested his elbows on the table. "It outlines the terms of our agreement. Our marriage will last for 1 year. During that time, you will live in my home, attend social events with me, and present yourself as my wife in every public capacity. In return, you and your children will be financially secure, and once the year is up, we will go our separate ways. No further obligations."
No complications.
Regina hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the table. "And my kids? They come with me." Andrew's expression didn't waver. "Of course. I wouldn't ask you to leave them behind." The ease of his answer caught her off guard. She had expected hesitation, perhaps even reluctance, but there was none. It made her wonder how much thought he had put into this, how much he had already considered before even presenting the idea to her. "What if I change my mind before the year is over?" she asked cautiously, testing the waters. Andrew studied her for a moment before responding. "Then you will still receive financial compensation, though not as much as if you fulfill the full term. The details of early termination are outlined in the contract." Regina exhaled slowly, her mind racing with the possibilities. "And what happens if you change your mind?" A ghost of a smirk crossed Andrew's lips, but it was gone just as quickly. "I won't." There was something about the certainty in his tone that sent a shiver down her spine. He spoke as if this was inevitable, as if he had already accounted for every possible scenario and had no doubts about the outcome. It should have unsettled her, but instead, it only made the offer feel even more real. 1 year. Just 1 year. And in return, she and her children would never have to struggle again. "When do we start?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a sleek black folder, placing it on the table in front of her. "I took the liberty of drafting the preliminary agreement," he said, sliding it toward her. Regina stared at the folder, her heart pounding. "You really came prepared for this, didn't you?" Andrew's gaze didn't waver. "I don't make impulsive decisions." With a deep breath, she opened the folder and began skimming the document. Everything was laid out in meticulous detail: the duration of the marriage, the public expectations, the financial provisions for her and her children, the confidentiality clauses. There was nothing about intimacy, nothing that required her to do anything beyond maintaining the appearance of a married couple. It was straightforward. Almost too straightforward. "Take the night to think it over," Andrew said, rising from his chair. "I'll expect your answer by morning." Regina remained seated as he shrugged on his coat and walked toward the door, her eyes still fixed on the contract. She listened to the sound of his footsteps as he exited the cafe, the door swinging shut behind him. The moment he was gone, she let out a slow, unsteady breath, her fingers tightening around the edges of the folder. This was real. This was happening. And by tomorrow, her life could be changed forever. She barely slept that night. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying Andrew's words over and over again. Every rational part of her told her this was reckless, that she was stepping into something she didn't fully understand. But there was another voice, quieter yet insistent, reminding her of the rent notices piling up, the empty fridge, the exhaustion in her children's eyes. Reminding her that this was a chance she might never get again. By morning, her decision was made. After dropping the kids off at school, she took the train to the address Andrew had given her, a towering glass high-rise in the heart of the city. The moment she stepped into the lobby, she felt out of place. Everything here was polished, elegant, a world apart from the life she knew. A receptionist guided her to the top floor, where she was led into a sleek office overlooking the skyline. Andrew was already there, seated behind a mahogany desk, his eyes cool and assessing as she entered. "Ms. Walker," he greeted, his voice as composed as ever. Regina inhaled sharply and met his gaze. "I've read the contract." Andrew set down his pen, watching her. "And?" She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I'll do it." For the first time since she had met him, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, satisfaction perhaps, but it was gone in an instant. He gestured toward the desk where the contract lay, an elegant black pen resting beside it. "Then let's make it official." Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the pen, hovering over the signature line. This was it. 1 year. One arrangement. One decision that would change everything. And then, with a deep breath, she signed her name. Andrew slid the contract back toward him, glancing at her signature before nodding. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Cadine." The words sent a chill down her spine. There was no turning back now. Regina barely had time to process what she had done before Andrew was already making arrangements. The efficiency with which he moved unsettled her. One moment, she was still holding the pen, staring at her signature on the contract, and the next, Andrew was on the phone, giving instructions to someone on the other end, his voice calm and authoritative. "She'll need a full wardrobe overhaul. Have a stylist ready by this evening. Also, arrange for a car to pick up her and the children from their current residence tomorrow morning. The transition needs to be seamless." Regina felt a strange detachment from it all, as though she were an observer in someone else's life. She had agreed to this. She had willingly signed her name, knowing full well what it meant. And yet, the reality of it was only now sinking in. Andrew hung up the phone and turned his gaze to her. "We'll need to make your move quickly. The media will find out soon, and I want to control the narrative before any speculation starts." Regina frowned. "The media?" Andrew leaned back slightly. "I'm a public figure, Regina. My engagement, our engagement, will be newsworthy. We'll release a statement in a few days, but before that, you need to be prepared. People will dig into your past, analyze your every move. From now on, your life will not be entirely your own." A cold weight settled in her stomach. She had expected changes, but she hadn't fully grasped the extent of what she was stepping into. Her entire life was about to be scrutinized. "What if someone finds out the truth?" she asked cautiously. Andrew's expression remained unreadable. "They won't." The certainty in his voice made her uneasy. She had no idea how deep his influence ran, but she could tell he was the kind of man who didn't leave things to chance. If he said people wouldn't find out, then he meant it. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "There's a car waiting outside. It will take you to a boutique where you'll be fitted for your new wardrobe. Consider this part of your preparation. I expect you to familiarize yourself with the expectations of your new life." Regina hesitated. "And my children? They'll be taken care of. You'll move them in tomorrow, but for now, I need you to focus on getting ready. This isn't just about you, Regina. You're about to step into my world, and I need to be certain you can handle it." Something about the way he said it stung. It was a reminder that this wasn't real, that she wasn't stepping into a marriage built on love or trust but on necessity. Still, she had made her choice. The next few hours passed in a blur. She was whisked away to an upscale boutique where a team of stylists and designers fussed over her, taking measurements, selecting dresses, and discussing fabrics in terms she barely understood. They spoke to her as if she were some kind of project, an unfinished product they were tasked with refining. "This color brings out her complexion beautifully," one of the stylists murmured, holding a deep emerald gown against her frame. "She'll need more tailored pieces. We want her to exude confidence, not look like she's playing dress-up," another added. Regina stood there, letting them talk about her as if she weren't present. It was overwhelming, but she forced herself to endure it. This was part of the deal. By the time the sun had set, she was exhausted. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. Gone were the worn-out jeans and simple sweaters she was used to. Instead, she was dressed in a fitted blazer and elegant trousers, her hair styled to perfection, her makeup flawless. She looked expensive, polished.
Like Simeone who belonged in Andrew Cadine's world.
But when she looked into her own eyes, she still saw the same woman she had been that morning. The mother who had struggled, who had sacrificed everything for her children. When she arrived back at her apartment that evening, she found the place eerily quiet. Her children were already asleep, curled up together on the worn-out couch they shared. She knelt beside them, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Tomorrow, everything would change. She didn't sleep much that night. When the morning came, she dressed in one of the outfits that had been selected for her, a soft cream blouse and a tailored skirt that hugged her figure in a way she wasn't used to. It felt unnatural, but she knew she had to get used to it. A sleek black car pulled up outside her apartment just as she finished packing the last of their things. The driver, a man in a pressed uniform, stepped out and opened the door for her. She hesitated, glancing back at the apartment she had called home for the past few years. It wasn't much, but it had been theirs.
Mama.
Her daughter's sleepy voice pulled her back to reality.
Regina forced a smile. Come on, sweetheart.
We're going to our new home. The ride to Andrew's estate was silent. Her children clung to her, confused but trusting. She wished she could explain everything to them, but how could she? How could she tell them that their new life was built on a lie? When they arrived, she was struck by the sheer size of the estate. It wasn't just a house, it was a mansion sprawling and pristine, with towering gates and a driveway long enough to disappear into the horizon. A staff of uniformed attendants waited at the entrance, standing in neat rows. Andrew was there, standing at the top of the steps, watching as they stepped out of the car. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes when he looked at the children, something she couldn't quite place. Regina took a deep breath and reached for her daughter's hand, leading her up the steps. "Welcome home," Andrew said smoothly, his gaze locking onto hers. Regina forced herself to smile. It was the beginning of a new life. A life built on a lie. The moment Regina stepped through the grand doors of Andrew's estate, she felt as though she had crossed into another world. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of an elaborate chandelier, casting intricate reflections that danced with every step she took. The air smelled of polished wood and fresh flowers, a stark contrast to the modest apartment she had just left behind. Everything about this place screamed wealth, from the high ceilings to the perfectly arranged furniture, untouched as if no one truly lived here. Her children clung to her hands, their small fingers wrapped tightly around hers. She could feel their apprehension in the way they pressed closer to her sides, their wide eyes darting around in a mix of awe and unease. They had never known a life like this, had never walked halls so silent, so pristine, so cold. Andrew stood a few feet away, watching them with an expression that was impossible to read. His presence was commanding, as always, dressed in another impeccably tailored suit, his posture relaxed yet deliberate. Regina could sense the weight of expectation in his gaze, as though he were assessing how well she and her children fit into this carefully curated world of his. A woman in a crisp black uniform stepped forward, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Mr. Cadine, the rooms have been prepared as requested," she said smoothly. Andrew nodded before turning his attention to Regina. "This is Margaret, the head of household staff. She will ensure you and the children have everything you need." Margaret gave a polite nod, her expression neutral. Regina could tell she was the type who had seen everything in this house but never spoken a word about it.
The kind of person who understood discretion better than most.
"If you'll follow me, ma'am, I'll show you to your rooms," Margaret said. Regina hesitated, glancing down at her children. "Go with her," Andrew instructed, his voice leaving little room for argument. "I'll speak with you once you're settled." There was no choice but to comply. Regina gently led her children forward, following Margaret down an expansive hallway lined with paintings she didn't recognize, their golden frames gleaming under soft lighting. The house was silent except for the soft clicks of their footsteps against the floor. When Margaret finally stopped, she pushed open a door to reveal a spacious bedroom. It was larger than Regina had expected, with high windows draped in thick, luxurious curtains, a king-sized bed adorned with neatly pressed linens, and a fireplace that looked more decorative than functional. Everything was arranged with precision, from the fresh flowers on the nightstand to the pristine set of luggage that had already been placed at the foot of the bed. "This will be your room," Margaret said. "The children's room is just across the hall." Regina glanced toward the door leading to the other room. "Can I see it?" Margaret nodded, stepping aside as Regina walked across the hall and opened the door. It was beautiful. The children's room was warm and inviting, decorated in soft pastels and plush furnishings. There were toys neatly arranged on shelves, books stacked beside the bed, and even a set of stuffed animals waiting as if they had always belonged there. It was everything a child could dream of, but Regina couldn't ignore the nagging thought that it had all been set up too perfectly. This wasn't a home, this was a stage, carefully arranged for the role she had agreed to play. Her daughter, Emily, let go of her hand and walked hesitantly toward the small bookshelf, her fingers brushing over the spines of the colorful books. "Are these for me?" she asked, her voice small.
Regina forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. They're all yours."
Emily looked up at her with uncertainty before slowly reaching for a book and pulling it into her arms. Her younger brother, Daniel, remained by Regina's side, his grip on her skirt unrelenting. Margaret cleared her throat.
"If you need anything, simply ring the bell, and Someone will assist you."
Regina nodded, murmuring a quiet thank you as Margaret exited the room, leaving them alone in their new reality. For a long moment, Regina simply stood there, watching as her children explored the space with cautious curiosity. This was their new life now. Whether or not it felt real, whether or not it felt right, they had no choice but to accept it. Later that evening, after the children had fallen asleep in their new beds, Regina found herself walking back toward the main part of the house. She wasn't sure what had drawn her there. Perhaps it was the weight of the silence pressing in on her, or maybe it was the knowledge that she had unfinished business with Andrew. She found him in the study, seated behind a massive wooden desk, reviewing a stack of documents. The room was dimly lit, the golden glow from a desk lamp casting shadows across his sharp features. He glanced up as she entered. Settling in.
Regina crossed her arms.
It's a lot. Andrew set his pen down. You'll adjust. She took a breath, steadying herself before she spoke again. The children, they're happy with the room. But they don't understand why we're here. Andrew leaned back slightly, studying her. And what did you tell them? That we were moving into a new home, she admitted. That's all they need to know for now. He nodded, as if satisfied with her response. Good. The less they question, the better. Regina frowned. Is that how you intend to raise our? She stopped herself, realizing what she was about to say. I mean, this arrangement. Do you expect them to just accept everything without question?
Andrews Expression hardenet lichtly.
Children adapt. It's the adults who struggle with change. She hated the way he spoke, as if emotions were just obstacles to be managed. But she couldn't argue with him, not now. She had agreed to this. He stood up, walking around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her. We have a public appearance in 2 days.
A charity gala.
It will be the first time people see us together. I expect you to be ready. Regina swallowed.
A gala.
He nodded. Consider it the official introduction of our engagement. There will be press, photographers, influential figures. You need to play the part. The reality of it hit her like a wave. This wasn't just about adjusting to a new home. This was about stepping into a role she had no experience in. She would be scrutinized, analyzed, judged. I'll do my best, she murmured. Andrew studied her for a moment before speaking again.
Regina, I cause you for a reason.
You might not see it now, but you are capable of handling this. She wanted to believe that, but she wasn't sure she did. As she left the study that night, making her way back to the unfamiliar room she was meant to call her own, she realized that the weight of deception was heavier than she had imagined. She had thought she was stepping into a new life, but in truth, she was stepping into a carefully crafted illusion. And the most dangerous part of all was that, with each passing moment, she was beginning to wonder if she could ever escape it. The next 2 days passed in a blur of rehearsed smiles and whispered instructions. Regina felt like a marionette being taught how to move in a world she didn't belong to. Every step, every glance, every word was carefully curated. There were etiquette lessons, clothing fittings, and even a personal stylist who seemed determined to mold her into the perfect fiancée of Andrew Cadine. She had always known stepping into this arrangement would be difficult, but she hadn't realized just how much of herself she would have to suppress. The morning of the gala, she stood before an opulent vanity mirror, watching as her reflection was transformed into someone she barely recognized. Her hair, which had always been kept in simple waves, was now styled in a sleek updo. The makeup artists had meticulously enhanced her features, sharp cheekbones, soft lips, eyes lined with precision. And the gown. It was a masterpiece, a floor-length creation in deep sapphire, its fabric hugging her figure in a way that felt both luxurious and suffocating. Behind her, the room buzzed with activity. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, adjusting the gown, perfecting every last detail. Regina barely spoke, nodding where necessary, allowing them to craft the illusion Andrew needed. It was surreal, the way she was being shaped to fit into this world of wealth and power. She wondered if any of the women here saw her as a person at all, or just another project to be polished to perfection. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. The room fell silent as Andrew stepped in. He was dressed in an immaculate black tuxedo, the crisp white of his shirt standing in sharp contrast against the deep color of her dress. His gaze swept over her, assessing, calculating. "Good," he said simply. "You'll do." Regina clenched her fingers against the fabric of her gown, a quiet surge of resentment bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She had expected nothing more, no compliments, no reassurances, just approval, measured and exact. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something lower, more controlled. Tonight is about perception. We are engaged, we are in love, and you are exactly where you belong. Do you understand? She met his gaze, forcing herself not to waver.
Yes.
Andrew studied her for a long moment, as if searching for any hint of resistance. When he found none, he offered his arm.
Let's go.
The gala was held at a grand estate just outside the city, a sprawling mansion with towering pillars and perfectly manicured gardens. The moment they arrived, cameras flashed in a frenzied rhythm, reporters calling out Andrew's name, followed quickly by hers. Regina tightened her grip on his arm, steadying herself as they stepped onto the red carpet. The lights were blinding, the voices overwhelming. She had never been the center of attention before, never been the subject of such intense scrutiny. The pressure to maintain the illusion was suffocating, but she kept her posture poised, her expression serene. Andrew was effortless, moving with the confidence of a man who had played this game his entire life. He knew exactly how to pose, how to smile just enough to appear charming but reserved. When he leaned down to whisper something into her ear, something meaningless for the cameras to capture, she responded with a soft laugh, tilting her face toward him as though he had just said the most wonderful thing in the world. Inside, the ballroom was a spectacle of wealth. Chandeliers glittered above them, casting a golden glow over guests adorned in designer gowns and tailored suits.
The air hummed with conversation, the sound of champagne glasses clinking against fine crystal.
Everywhere Regina looked, there were eyes watching, judging. Andrew led her through the room with practiced ease, introducing her to people whose names she barely caught. They were politicians, CEOs, heirs to old money empires. And they were all interested in her, the woman who had seemingly come from nowhere to stand beside Andrew Cadine. "Andrew, you've been keeping this one a secret," an older man with a distinguished air remarked, his eyes scanning Regina with curiosity. Andrew smiled, his grip on her waist tightening slightly. "Some things are worth waiting to reveal." Regina forced a polite smile, responding to the polite pleasantries with carefully measured words. She had rehearsed this, had been told what to say, how to say it. And yet, beneath the charm and grace, she felt the weight of the deception pressing down on her. Then, across the room, she caught sight of a woman watching her intently. She was beautiful, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that held something unreadable. Unlike the others, she wasn't engaged in idle chatter, nor did she approach with feigned pleasantries. She simply stood there, observing. Regina's stomach tightened. There was something about the woman that unsettled her. Later that evening, when she had a moment to herself, she stepped onto the balcony, inhaling deeply as she tried to steady the storm of emotions inside her. The night air was crisp, a stark contrast to the warmth inside. "You play the part well," a voice said from behind. Regina turned, startled, only to find the same woman from earlier standing near the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the woman took a slow step forward, her expression unreadable. "I've been where you are," she murmured. Regina's pulse quickened.
"I don't know what you mean."
The woman tilted her head slightly, as though considering whether to push further. Then she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes.
"Be careful, Regina.
This world doesn't take kindly to outsiders." Before Regina could respond, the woman turned and disappeared into the crowd. She stood there for a long time, her mind racing. Who was she? And why did her words feel like a warning? Inside, Andrew was still playing the role of the charming billionaire, still effortlessly navigating the social circles he had always belonged to. But for the first time, Regina felt a deep, unsettling suspicion creep into her mind. There were shadows beneath the surface of this arrangement, secrets she wasn't meant to uncover. And yet, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that she was being watched, not just by the public, but by something or someone far more dangerous. Regina felt the weight of the woman's words long after she had disappeared into the sea of elegantly dressed guests. "Be careful. This world doesn't take kindly to outsiders." The phrase echoed in her mind like an unsettling melody, a quiet warning laced with something she couldn't quite place. Pity? Experience? Perhaps both. She turned back toward the ballroom, scanning the space for Andrew. He stood near a cluster of men who exuded power, their conversation laced with a kind of quiet arrogance that came from knowing they controlled the world. His posture was relaxed, his expression composed, but she had been around him long enough to recognize the flicker of calculation behind his gaze. He wasn't just talking, he was maneuvering, strategizing, playing the invisible game that dictated wealth and influence. For the first time since stepping into this world, she wondered if she had underestimated him. A waiter passed by, offering a tray of champagne, and she accepted a glass, though she barely touched it to her lips. She needed something to occupy her hands, something to ground her in the midst of all the pretense. Her thoughts were too chaotic, her pulse too quick. Who was that woman? And more importantly, why had she warned her? Regina had always known that stepping into Andrew Cadine's life meant playing a role. But tonight, for the first time, she felt like she was being watched for reasons beyond curiosity. There was an undercurrent beneath the surface, something she hadn't yet grasped. A presence at her side drew her from her thoughts. She turned slightly, only to find Andrew standing beside her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. "You disappeared," he murmured, his voice calm, but laced with something that made her stomach tighten. "I needed air." His gaze flickered toward the balcony, then back to her. "I saw you speaking with Victoria."
Victoria.
So that was her name. She seemed interesting, Regina said carefully. Andrew's fingers pressed slightly against her back, a warning, subtle but firm. "She used to be engaged to my brother."
Regina blinked.
This was the first time he had mentioned having a brother. "And where is he now?" Andrew's jaw tightened, just for a moment, before his expression smoothed.
"Dead."
A chill ran through her. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he had said them, calm, indifferent, as though the loss of a sibling was nothing more than a fact, an inconvenience. She was about to ask more, but before she could, a man approached. He was older, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes were sharp, observant. He held out a hand to Regina, his smile polite but assessing. "You must be the fiancé we've all been hearing about," he said. Regina accepted his handshake.
"Regina Carter."
"Philip Dawson," the man replied. "I've known Andrew's family for years." Something about the way he said it sent a prickle of unease through her. Andrew's grip on her waist tightened slightly, his body shifting just enough to assert possession. Philip's gaze flickered between them before settling on Regina once more. "I must say, you're a surprising choice. I had assumed Andrew would follow tradition, but it seems he enjoys being unpredictable." Regina smiled, though she wasn't sure if the words were meant as a compliment.
"Life is full of surprises."
Philip chuckled, but there was something knowing in his expression.
"Indeed."
As he walked away, Regina turned to Andrew. What did he mean by that? Andrew's expression remained neutral, but she felt the tension in his body. Ignore him. But she couldn't. Not when there were too many things left unsaid. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversations and careful glances. By the time they finally left the gala, Regina felt like she had been wound so tightly that one wrong move might cause her to shatter. The car ride back to Andrew's estate was quiet. He sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the city lights passing by. Regina wanted to ask more about Victoria, about his brother, about Philip Dawson's words, but something held her back. Instead, she said, "That wasn't just about public appearance tonight, was it?" Andrew turned his head slightly, regarding her with an unreadable expression.
"What do you mean?"
"You were watching people. Calculating. That wasn't just an engagement announcement, it was something else." A small, almost amused smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You're more observant than I gave you credit for." She waited for an answer, but he simply turned back to the window, leaving her with nothing but silence. When they arrived at the estate, Regina expected Andrew to head straight to his office as he often did, but instead, he followed her up the stairs. The moment they stepped into her room, he shut the door behind them. "You need to be careful," he said, his voice quieter now, lower. Regina frowned. "Careful of what?" "People like Philip."
"Like Victoria."
Something about the way he said it sent a flicker of unease through her. "You didn't seem too concerned about Philip," she pointed out.
Andrew exhalet. A rare sign of frustration.
"He enjoys playing mind games. Don't let him get inside your head."
And Victoria. Hayes expression darkens lichtly.
"She was engaged to my brother, Daniel. She knew him better than anyone. And she still couldn't save him."
Regina's breed kaukt.
Save him. Andrew hesitated, just for a moment before he said, "My brother didn't die by accident." The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken.
A ran down Regina's spine.
Then how did he die? Andrew held her gaze, his expression unreadable. That's not something you need to concern yourself with. But she already was. Because for the first time since stepping into Andrew Cadine's world, Regina realized she might not be the only one pretending. And that terrified her more than anything else.
Regina barely slept that night.
Andrew's words haunted her, circling in her mind like a vulture over prey. My brother didn't die by accident. He hadn't elaborated, hadn't given her anything more than that single ominous sentence before shutting himself off completely. She had learned to recognize when Andrew was done with a conversation. There was an invisible wall that he built around certain topics, an unspoken command that she had no choice but to obey. But this time, she couldn't let it go. Something inside her told her that Daniel's death wasn't just a tragic loss. It was a wound, one that hadn't healed, one that still festered beneath the polished exterior of the Cadine family's world. She rose from bed before the sun had even begun to rise, wrapping a silk robe around her shoulders as she stepped onto the balcony. The estate was quiet at this hour, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts raging inside her. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of the distant ocean.
Some wäre in the distance, alone ovel hutet, breaking the silence.
Her mind drifted back to Victoria. The woman had known Andrew's brother, had been engaged to him, had loved him, or so Regina assumed. And yet, there had been something in her voice last night, something laced with quiet bitterness. She knew him better than anyone. And she still couldn't save him. What had happened to Daniel Cadine? Regina knew she wouldn't get answers from Andrew, at least not yet. But Victoria? She was a different story. By the time morning arrived, Regina had already made her decision. She dressed carefully, choosing a dark green blouse and a pencil skirt that accentuated her figure without being too obvious. She needed to look polished, in control. If she was going to get answers from Victoria, she couldn't afford to appear hesitant. When she stepped into the grand dining hall, Andrew was already there, sipping his coffee while scanning the morning paper. He barely glanced up as she entered, but she could feel his awareness of her, the way his posture subtly adjusted in response to her presence. "I have plans today," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Andrew finally set the paper down, tilting his head slightly. "Do you?"
"Yes."
He studied her for a moment, and she knew he was trying to read her. She had become good at keeping certain things from him, small things, things that didn't matter. But today, she wasn't sure if she was hiding the truth well enough.
"Where are you going?"
Regina took a sip of her coffee before answering.
"Shopping. Lunch."
It wasn't a complete lie. She would need a cover if she planned on meeting Victoria. Andrew leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against the table.
"You should take security with you."
"I don't need a bodyguard to go shopping." His expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. He didn't like it. But he wouldn't push, at least not yet. She finished her breakfast quickly, kissing him lightly on the cheek before heading out. She didn't miss the way his eyes followed her as she left, nor the slight tension in his jaw. She had to move carefully. Regina drove herself into the city, feeling the weight of the Cadine name in every glance she received. People knew who she was now, Andrew Cadine's fiancée. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with judgment. She had stepped into a world that thrived on perception, on the illusion of control. But she wasn't here for them. Victoria's apartment was in a quiet, upscale part of the city. The kind of place that belonged to someone who had money but didn't need to flaunt it. Regina hesitated only for a second before knocking. The door opened a few moments later, and Victoria's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "I wasn't expecting you," she said, leaning against the frame. "I thought we should talk," Regina replied. Victoria studied her for a long moment before stepping aside.
"Come in."
The apartment was elegant but understated. A glass of red wine sat half-finished on the coffee table, a novel open beside it. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air. Regina sat across from Victoria, watching as the woman crossed her legs, tilting her head slightly. "I assume this isn't a social visit." "No," Regina admitted. "It's about Daniel." Victoria's expression remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes.
She exhaled softly, running a finger along the rim of her glass. I schuldwe knaun you'd ask.
Andrew won't tell me anything, Regina continued. But I can tell there's more to the story.
Victoria lädt out Aquitlauk.
Of course he won't. The Cadens are masters at burying the past.
Regina leant vorwärts lichtli. Tintel ese trut.
Victoria was silent for a long moment. Then she said, Daniel didn't belong in that family. He was too soft, too kind. He wanted out. Regina frowned. Out. Victoria nodded. He hated the expectations, the way they controlled everything. Andrew was always the golden son, the one who played by the rules. But Daniel? He wanted something else. Then what happened?
Victoria hesitated.
He was going to leave. He told me the night before he died. Regina's breath caught. You think he was killed? Victoria met her gaze. I don't think. I know.
Achillran trug Regina.
Do you think Andrew? No, Victoria cut in quickly. Andrew loved his brother. But love isn't always enough in that family. Regina's mind spun. If Andrew hadn't been responsible, then who? Before she could ask more, Victoria leaned forward.
You need to be careful, Regina.
You think you understand the world you've stepped into, but you don't. The Cadens only allow people in if they can control them. Regina swallowed hard. Then why are you telling me this? Victoria's gaze softened slightly.
Because I see something in you.
The same thing I saw in myself when I was with Daniel. Regina stood, her thoughts a whirlwind. As she reached the door, Victoria's voice stopped her.
Be careful what you ask for, Regina. The truth isn't always what you want it to be.
Regina stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding. She had come for answers, but all she had now were more questions. Regina drove back in silence, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Victoria's words replayed in her mind, each syllable pressing deeper into her thoughts like a whisper she couldn't ignore. Daniel didn't belong in that family. He wanted out. He was going to leave. He told me the night before he died. I don't think. I know. The implications were too heavy to dismiss. If Daniel's death wasn't an accident, then someone had ensured that he wouldn't get the chance to walk away. And if Andrew wasn't responsible, then who? Her heart pounded as she pulled into the long driveway of the Cadine estate, the sprawling mansion standing against the dimming sky like a monument to power and secrecy. The weight of what she had learned pressed down on her, but she knew she couldn't reveal any of it to Andrew. Not yet. As she stepped inside, the sound of footsteps echoed in the grand hall. A butler nodded at her, but she barely acknowledged him, her mind too preoccupied to register the polite pleasantries of the household staff. She climbed the staircase, her heels clicking against the polished wood as she made her way to the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, she saw Andrew standing near the window, his back to her. He had removed his suit jacket, the crisp white shirt hugging his frame as he nursed a glass of whiskey in one hand. The setting sun cast a golden glow on his silhouette, making him seem almost unreachable, a man trapped in his own world of burdens.
For a brief moment, Regina hesitated.
There were so many things she wanted to ask him, to demand from him. But she couldn't. Not yet. She stepped inside quietly. Long day. Andrew turned his head slightly, acknowledging her presence before taking a slow sip from his glass. Eventful. She walked toward him, her gaze searching his face for any cracks in his composure. Anything I should know about? His lips curled into a faint smirk, but there was no warmth in it. Nothing that concerns you. She swallowed the sharp retort that threatened to rise in her throat. He was keeping secrets, secrets that likely tied back to Daniel's death. And now she had secrets of her own. Regina moved closer, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against the firm muscles of his back. She felt the tension in him, the way his body stiffened slightly before he exhaled. I worry about you, she murmured, her fingers tracing small circles against his shirt. Andrew placed his free hand over hers, squeezing gently. There's nothing to worry about. That was a lie. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of him. If she pushed too hard, too soon, she risked losing the small fragments of trust she had managed to build with him. She had to be careful, had to move like a chess player navigating a board full of unseen threats. But she would find out the truth. That night, as Andrew lay asleep beside her, Regina stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She could feel his warmth against her, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the illusion of peace that he carried even in sleep. But she knew better now. The world he belonged to was not built on peace. It was built on control, on power, on secrets buried so deep that even those closest to him might never uncover them. She thought about Victoria's warning. The Cadens only allow people in if they can control them. Was that what was happening to her? Had she been so blinded by her feelings for Andrew that she hadn't seen the cage slowly closing around her?
The next morning, Regina woke before dawn.
Andrew was already gone. A note lay on his pillow, written in his sharp, elegant handwriting.
Business in the city. Il be back later.
She traced her fingers over the ink, wondering what business could possibly require his attention so early. But she already knew the answer. It was the same business that had kept Daniel trapped, the same business that had likely gotten him killed. Regina dressed quickly, her mind set on one thing: finding out what Andrew wasn't telling her. She spent the morning going through every article she could find on Daniel Cadin's death. The official reports all pointed to a simple explanation: a car accident, a late-night drive gone wrong, no foul play suspected. But as she read further, small inconsistencies began to emerge. The location of the crash, the lack of skid marks on the road, the conflicting statements from those who had last seen him alive. It was subtle, easy to overlook. But it was there. Someone had made sure Daniel's death looked like an accident. Her heart pounded as she sat back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. If she could see these discrepancies, then so could Andrew. He had known all along. And yet, he had never said a word. Why? Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts.
Unknown number.
She hesitated for only a second before answering. Hello. A pause. Then, a woman's voice. You need to stop digging.
Regina's breath caught.
Who is this? The line went dead. She stared at the screen, a cold chill running down her spine. Someone was watching her.
Zomeone Knie.
She had just stepped into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. Regina sat frozen, her phone still pressed against her ear even though the call had long ended. The voice on the other end, calm, measured, and unmistakably threatening, sent a shiver down her spine. Someone knew she was looking into Daniel's death. Someone wanted her to stop. Her first instinct was to tell Andrew. But as quickly as the thought surfaced, she pushed it away. He had known the truth all along. If he hadn't told her by now, it meant he had a reason for keeping her in the dark. And if he was keeping secrets, then there was a chance, however small, that he was part of the danger she was walking into. She placed her phone on the table, exhaling slowly to steady herself. There was no turning back now. She had spent too much time looking away, pretending not to notice the cracks in the perfect world she had stepped into. If she stopped now, she would never forgive herself. She needed answers. With a renewed sense of determination, Regina grabbed her keys and left the house. The Cadine estate, with its towering walls and endless hallways, felt suffocating. She needed space to think. Her first stop was the city library, a place few in Andrew's social circle would ever expect her to go. She scoured the archives, searching for anything that might give her a new lead. The official reports on Daniel's accident were clean, too clean. But the deeper she dug, the more inconsistencies she found. Witness accounts from the night of his death had been altered. Statements that had once mentioned a second car near the crash site had disappeared from the record. She flipped through an old newspaper article and paused at a single name buried in the fine print.
Detective Michael Graves.
Regina quickly searched for more information on him. He had been one of the original officers assigned to Daniel's case, but less than a month after the investigation was closed, he had resigned from the force. No official reason was given. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Pulling out her phone, she found an address linked to Graves in a part of town far from the polished high-rises and exclusive clubs of the Cadine world. She didn't hesitate. It was nearly an hour later when she arrived at the detective's house. It was small, unassuming, the kind of place where a man who wanted to disappear might live. She knocked, stepping back as the door creaked open. Michael Graves stood in the doorway, older than she expected, his graying hair and tired eyes giving him a weathered appearance. He studied her carefully. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. Regina squared her shoulders. "I think you know why I am." A flicker of something, recognition, maybe regret, passed over his face. He hesitated, then stepped aside. "You have 5 minutes." Inside, the house was sparse, with barely any furniture and stacks of old case files covering the dining table. Regina took a deep breath, her mind racing. "I know Daniel's death wasn't an accident," she said. "And I think you do too." Graves let out a slow exhale. He walked over to the table, picking up a glass of whiskey and downing it in one gulp before speaking. "You should let this go." "I can't." His eyes met hers, something wary and knowing in them. "Then you need to understand something. The people involved in this, if you keep pushing, you won't just be putting yourself in danger." Regina's pulse quickened. "Who are they?" Graves hesitated before speaking again, his voice low. "The Cadens don't make mistakes. If Daniel was going to leave, if he was a liability to them, then someone made sure he didn't get the chance." She swallowed hard. "You're saying his own family had him killed?" Graves didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into a pile of papers and pulled out an old photograph, handing it to her. Regina stared at it. The image was faded, but she could see Daniel standing next to another man, a man she recognized immediately. Andrew. Graves' voice was quiet but firm. "I don't know who gave the order, but I know who benefited the most." Regina's grip on the photograph tightened. Andrew. It couldn't be. Everything inside her wanted to reject the idea. Andrew had loved his brother. She had seen the grief in his eyes, had felt the weight of it in his silence. He couldn't have done this. But if he hadn't, who had? Her head spun as she stood, gripping the chair for support. "I need to know everything you know." Graves studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then you better sit down. Because this doesn't end with Daniel." Regina took a shaky breath and braced herself for what was to come. Regina felt the weight of the words pressing down on her, the reality of what she had just heard settling into her bones like a deep, unshakable cold. Daniel's death had never been a simple tragedy, it had been orchestrated. And now the person she had trusted most in this world, the man she had loved, stood at the center of it all. Graves watched her in silence as she processed the truth, his face lined with a kind of exhaustion that came from knowing too much for too long. He had seen it before, the moment when everything someone believed in came crashing down around them. Regina wanted to scream, to demand answers, to deny what she had just learned. But denial wouldn't change the facts. Her hands trembled as she placed the photograph back on the table, her mind racing through every interaction she had ever had with Andrew. The grief he had shown after Daniel's death, the way his voice had cracked when he spoke of his brother, had it all been a lie? Had she spent years beside a man who had blood on his hands? She forced herself to focus, to breathe through the storm raging inside her. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Graves poured himself another drink before he spoke. Daniel wanted out. He had learned things about his family that put him in a dangerous position. He wasn't just leaving for a fresh start, he was planning to expose something. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. And that made him a problem. Regina felt her chest tighten. Expose what? Graves hesitated, swirling the liquid in his glass. The Cadens built their empire on more than just business deals and smart investments. They had connections, powerful connections, ones that could make problems disappear. Daniel found something they couldn't afford to let out. Regina clenched her jaw. "And you're telling me Andrew was part of that?"
Graves exhaled sharply.
"I don't know what role he played, but I know one thing. Andrew became the sole heir after Daniel was gone. He took over everything. And that doesn't happen in a family like theirs without someone pulling the strings." Her stomach twisted. She wanted to believe Andrew was innocent, that there was some explanation she hadn't seen yet. But if there was, why had he never told her the truth? Why had he let her dig through the past alone, knowing the danger that lurked there? She rose from her chair, every nerve in her body screaming at her to move. "I need to see him." Graves shook his head. "Regina, if you confront him now." "I have to." Her voice was sharp, final. "I need to hear it from him." The drive back to the Cadena estate was a blur. Her mind replayed every conversation, every moment of hesitation she had ignored. The way Andrew had always steered conversations away from Daniel, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes whenever she had asked too many questions. Had it been guilt? Or something darker? The house loomed ahead, its grand facade untouched by the turmoil raging inside her. Regina didn't bother knocking. She stormed inside, her heels echoing through the vast entryway. A butler tried to stop her, but she barely heard him. "Where is he?" she demanded. The man hesitated before nodding toward Andrew's study. Regina pushed open the door without hesitation. Andrew stood by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his expression unreadable as he turned to face her. The golden glow of the fire cast shadows across his face, making him look almost unfamiliar. "You're back," he said calmly, as if nothing had changed. She took a step closer, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Why didn't you tell me?" His jaw tightened. "Tell you what?" "About Daniel." Silence. Regina swallowed the lump in her throat. "I know he didn't die in an accident. I know he was silenced. And I know you knew." Andrew exhaled slowly, setting his glass down on the mantel. "Who have you been talking to?" Her breath hitched at the way he asked, not with surprise, but with something that felt dangerously close to disappointment. "That's all you have to say," she whispered. Not a denial. Andrew ran a hand through his hair, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "You don't understand, Regina." "Then make me understand." Her voice broke, years of trust crumbling beneath the weight of the truth. "Tell me you didn't have anything to do with it. Tell me this isn't who you are." Andrew's expression darkened. "You want the truth?" He took a slow step forward. "Daniel wasn't who you thought he was. He wasn't some innocent victim." Regina stiffened. "That's not an answer." He sighed, as if exhausted. "Daniel got involved with dangerous people. He made promises he couldn't keep, and when it all started falling apart, he ran. He wasn't trying to expose anything, he was trying to save himself." Her stomach twisted. "And that justifies what happened to him?" Andrew's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I didn't kill my brother." "But you know who did," she accused. Silence stretched between them. The fire crackled, filling the space between words left unspoken. Regina's voice dropped to a whisper. "You let me love you while knowing this truth." Andrew's expression didn't change. "I did what I had to do." She felt like the ground beneath her was splitting apart. The man she had built a life with, the man she had trusted, he had been lying to her all along. She turned away, barely able to breathe. "I can't do this." Andrew's voice was quiet. "Regina, if you walk away now, you need to understand, you won't be safe. The people who took care of Daniel don't tolerate loose ends." She stopped, her blood turning to ice. "Is that a threat?" His voice was almost gentle. "It's a warning." Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had given him everything, her love, her trust, her loyalty. And in return, he had given her a lie. Without another word, she walked out of the room, out of the house that no longer felt like home. She didn't look back. The cold night air bit at Regina's skin as she stepped outside the Cadine estate, but it was nothing compared to the ice settling in her veins. Her hands were shaking, her breaths coming too fast as she forced herself to move, to keep walking away from the house that had once been a symbol of love and security but had now become a prison of deception and danger. Every step away from Andrew felt like shedding a part of herself, leaving behind the woman who had trusted him, who had built a life with him, who had believed in his love. She reached her car and fumbled with the keys, her mind racing. Everything Graves had told her was true. Andrew hadn't even tried to deny it. He had stood there, calm and unrepentant, warning her rather than fighting for her. It was as if he had already accepted that she would leave, that there was nothing left to salvage. But it wasn't just the betrayal that sent chills down her spine, it was the unspoken threat in his voice, the quiet certainty that she was now a liability. She couldn't go home. Not now. If what Andrew had said was true, if the people responsible for Daniel's death didn't tolerate loose ends, then she was in danger. They wouldn't hesitate to silence her just as they had silenced Daniel. And Andrew. Andrew wouldn't stop them. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she tried to steady her breath. She had spent too long being blind, too long allowing love to cloud her judgment. Now she had to think. She had to act. She reached for her phone and dialed the only person she knew could help. Graves picked up on the first ring. "You were right," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Andrew knew. He knew everything. There was a pause on the other end. Then, Graves' voice, steady and sharp. "Where are you?" "Just outside the estate." "Drive. Now. Don't go home. Meet me at the old train station on Maple. We don't have much time." Regina didn't ask questions. She started the engine and pulled onto the road, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't know what she expected to happen next, only that she couldn't do this alone. The drive felt endless, the darkness pressing in around her. Every set of headlights in her rearview mirror made her pulse spike, every turn felt like a potential trap. She had always thought she understood fear, but this was different. This wasn't fear of heartbreak or disappointment. This was the fear of knowing that someone wanted you dead. When she finally pulled into the abandoned train station, Graves was already there, leaning against his car with his arms crossed. The dim glow of a street lamp barely illuminated his face, but she could see the tension in his stance, the quiet readiness of a man who had been preparing for this moment for a long time. She got out of the car, wrapping her arms around herself as she approached him. "What now?" Graves exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You need to disappear." Regina stiffened. "Disappear? You don't have a choice. Andrew warned you because he cares, maybe in his own twisted way, but that doesn't change the fact that you're a problem now. And the people who cleaned up Daniel's mess won't hesitate to clean up yours." He met her gaze, his expression grim. "If you stay, you won't make it out alive." Regina swallowed hard. "I can't just run." "You can, and you have to." She shook her head, the weight of it all crashing down on her. "I can't just vanish and let them get away with it. I can't let Andrew," her voice broke. "I can't let him win." Graves' eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. "This isn't about winning. This is about surviving." Regina turned away, her mind racing. Every part of her rebelled against the idea of running. She had spent too long in the dark, too long being controlled. But what could she do? How could she fight people who had already erased one life without consequence? She closed her eyes, forcing herself to think. And then slowly, an idea took shape. "What if I don't disappear?" she said quietly.
Graves frowned.
"Regina."
"No."
"Listen." She turned back to him, her voice steadying. "They want to silence me because I know the truth. But what if I make sure I'm not the only one who knows? What if I make it impossible for them to erase me?" Graves studied her for a long moment. Then, something shifted in his expression. "You want to go public?" She nodded. "Not just with what I know, with proof. Real proof." Graves exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "That's a hell of a risk." "So is running," she shot back. "And if I run, they'll find me eventually. This is the only way to fight back." He was quiet for a long time, then finally, he nodded. "All right. But if we do this, we do it right." They spent the next hour making a plan. Graves had contacts, people who had been waiting for something like this, waiting for a crack in the Kadeen empire. He would handle the evidence, make sure it got into the right hands. Regina, meanwhile, would go into hiding, not forever, just long enough for the truth to come out. By the time they finished, the first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon. Regina felt exhausted, but for the first time in days, she also felt something else. Hope. She turned to Graves as she prepared to leave. "Do you think Andrew will try to stop me?" Graves hesitated before answering. "I think Andrew made his choice a long time ago. And now it's time for you to make yours." Regina nodded, gripping the steering wheel as she prepared to drive away. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She wasn't running anymore. And no matter what it took, she would make sure the world knew the truth. Regina drove away from the abandoned train station, the weight of the past pressing heavily on her shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, she was not afraid. The sky ahead was no longer the oppressive darkness she had come to know, but a canvas of pale gold and soft blue, a quiet promise that a new day was beginning. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. The people she was fighting were powerful, ruthless, and would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But she also knew that she was not the same woman who had once trusted blindly, who had once believed that love could shield her from betrayal. She was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. She was the one making the moves now. In the days that followed, the truth unraveled like a wildfire. The carefully constructed lies that Andrew and the Cadine family had built over the years began to crumble. Evidence surfaced, people came forward, and the name that had once been synonymous with power and influence became a symbol of scandal and corruption. Regina watched from afar as the world finally saw the truth. She read the headlines, heard the whispers, saw the fall of the man she had once loved. Andrew Cadine was no longer untouchable. He had played the game for too long, believing he could control everything and everyone around him. But in the end, he had underestimated her. She thought of him often, not with longing, not with love, but with a quiet understanding that some people could never be saved. He had chosen his path long before she had ever walked into his life. And now, she had chosen hers. When the storm finally settled, Regina stood at the edge of the ocean, the waves stretching endlessly before her. She breathed in the salt air, letting the past wash away with the tide. She had lost so much, but she had gained something greater, freedom. She was no longer defined by betrayal, by fear, by the ghosts of what could have been. She had survived. She had won. And for the first time in her life, the future was truly hers. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. Your support means the world and helps bring more amazing stories to life. Stay tuned for more. See you in the next one.